Everyone has fond memories of their youth. These were much simpler times, and we tend to look back at these days with rose-colored glasses. Typically, some of the things we remember most are the media that entertained us so much back then. In our formative years, the shows, movies, music, and games we enjoyed shaped our childhoods, and we have an attachment to them. But as we get older, many of us seem to think that we're supposed to leave the memories behind us. That once we're older, we shouldn't watch or play with them anymore. The reason we watch shows like Pokemon or Rugrats is because we were kids, and thus they were for kids. It's just for kids. The dreaded phrase meant to belittle and shame those who dare partake in something like, say, an anime movie just because it isn't adult. There were a few key problems with this mindset that I want to break down and provide a counter to. First off, the just for kids phrase tends to be used to mock those who enjoy specific forms of media. The most common examples being video games and cartoons, generally any kind of animation that isn't from Japan. For this video, we'll be mostly focusing on animation, as that is the most apparent. Anime is typically treated as its own separate form of media, and it's generally understood that anime appeals to all age demographics. However, cartoons in the West, as most of you are aware, are deemed to be aimed exclusively at children. This is due to most cartoons in the West being aired on networks such as Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, Disney Channel, Disney XD, and PBS. These channels are all either marketed at kids specifically, or have separate adult-aimed blocks that give the impression of the rest of the station's programming being for kids.
It's all kids out of the pool for Adult Swim.
You can see this within the networks all the time, with commercials for toys, back-to-school gear, children's clothes, etc. Sometimes the network itself will even advertise this fact. However, this means that people tend to have a very black and white mindset about animation, and say that cartoons are for kids. This is not 100% true. Yes, a majority of television and theatrical animation is aimed for kids, but there's a difference between being for kids and appropriate for kids. Something like Sesame Street is aimed directly at kids, whereas something like Angry Beavers is appropriate for kids, and thus is appropriate for everyone. In contrast, you have adult-oriented shows on networks like Adult Swim and Fox, and while not all of them are like this, there's a large group of shows that try to be adult, and the way they go about this is by trying to make adult jokes or offensive humor. They tend to come off more as parodies of what the perceived notion of animation is outside of Japan, and in their attempt at being for adults, seem even more childish than the cartoons at times. Before I go any further on this, let's step back in time to see where cartoons were before the rise of Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network. Back in the 70s and 80s, cartoons were generally an afterthought. In the 70s, most shows were trying to either ape off the success of Scooby-Doo, or had a connection to a celebrity of some sort. Remember the time when Muhammad Ali and Fonzie had cartoons? Remember when Casper went to space to solve mysteries? And in the 80s, most cartoons were made purely to sell toys. This is not an insult to any of these shows, it's just a fact that this is how they came into fruition.
You know, Star Wars has a movie, and the kids know the story, and they go buy the characters. What have you guys got? Oh, didn't we tell you?
Well, we're going to have a comic book series.
In the meeting, I mentioned, how does anybody know who these characters are? We don't have a $30 million movie like Star Wars. We don't have a TV show.
You know, didn't you say the kids play with us when they're 5 years old? I said, yeah. He said, well, they don't read at 5, so what's a comic book going to do? I mean, I didn't mention the 2 one-hour specials. Blue Scheimer suggested rather than 2 one-hour specials, for almost the same money, we could get a whole syndicated show.
And the fact that these shows were so popular means they did very well in this regard. Transformers alone has such a huge following, but of course these shows were made to be commercials, since actual commercials had legal limits on how much animation they could have.
At the time, in the early 1980s,
Congratulations! It's a potato!
the regulations said that when you advertise a toy to a kid, the commercial can only have 7 seconds of animation.
So you make a TV show to A, showcase the characters you could buy, and B, get kids invested in said characters to make them want to buy them. And this practice hasn't gone away. Most of these toy-themed shows are still around in some fashion, and the toys are essentially what fund certain shows. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be toys of kids' properties. I mean, when you're a kid, you want toys of everything you love so you can always play with them. When I was a kid, I would have loved to have Crash Bandicoot beat up the Heartless with Sonic and Godzilla. Oh, and an emphasis on Godzilla there. We get mad whenever they don't make a toy out of a monster.
Where the fuck is Ebira?
La 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 la, la 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 la, Elmo's world.
But because of this fact, it means the shows had to abide by the wishes of the toy company. If a new toy was made, they had to make a character for that toy. Certain storylines were dictated by the toys. Some things couldn't be done because of it, etc., etc. Ever wonder why they killed so much of the principal cast off in Transformers the movie? To make way for Wave 2. But suddenly in the 90s, Nickelodeon comes in looking for their own original animation. And that they saw the release of 3 shows: Rugrats, Doug, and Ren and Stimpy. What were these 3 shows that the majority of the 80s shows weren't? They were creator-driven cartoons. The creators were allowed to make the shows they wanted. They weren't making a show for a toy company in order to sell units. They were telling the stories they specifically wanted to tell. They need only be able to show them to kids. That's it. They just had to be suitable for kids to see. They were not necessarily making shows for kids. They were making shows for anyone. Have you ever at one point watched a cartoon from your youth and pick up on many things you didn't understand as a kid, but now as an adult you understand? Many people tend to have the reaction of, oh my god, how did they get away with that? Well, there's why. Because these shows weren't just for kids, they were for everyone. Yes, they marketed it to kids since animation plays very well to kids, but anyone can watch it, and they did.
Cartoons aren't just for kids. They're for us adults, too. The cartoon audience is a whopping 44.6% adults. That's about 1 adult for every kid watching. And why not? We grew up on cartoons.
You could also say this for animation from the early 1900s to the 40s or so, specifically talking about the animation from the early 1900s up to the 1920s. But that's mainly because animation in general was such a new concept that they were doing anything back then. There was no real demographic at the time, it was all experimental, which you can see from some of the things that were created at the time. It was just about showing things you couldn't do in any other type of film. So those by default aren't for anyone, which means that they can be for anyone. But more to the point, these shows are not just for kids, they're meant for anyone. Anyone of any age can watch a show like Regular Show, Adventure Time, Hilda, Voltron, Avatar, OKKO, Craig of the Creek, Teen Titans, Phineas and Ferb, etc. And this is not to say that there aren't shows that are deliberately made only for kids. Of course there are. There always will be. Shows like Sesame Street and Clifford are aimed only at kids, specifically younger children for those formative years. And that's okay. But remember, usually kids aren't left to their own devices this young, and the parents are with them. Adults are always watching these shows and can even get an appreciation for them. I'm sure there are plenty of adult fans of Sesame Street who watch it for the wholesome nature and have fond memories of Big Bird and like to watch it as a family. And even separating them from the equation altogether, there's something else we need to remember. All of these shows, video games, movies, etc., somebody has to make them. And no matter what Nickelodeon says, kids likely don't have the skill, know-how, or budget to make these things. Adults are the ones behind these shows. It takes a considerable amount of work to make these programs. All of this effort, no matter what it is, merits some sort of appreciation from anyone of any age. And of course, parents tend to watch things with their children. Adults are going to see these, and the creators know this. This is why you'll tend to see the occasional adult joke that slips over the kids' heads.
Oh baby, oh baby, oh baby. Rocco.
And children typically don't have money. Adults have to take them to see movies, and anime movies are also aware of this. Films like Wreck-It Ralph, Moana, Tangled, Hunchback, Lion King, and others are, just like those creator-driven shows, not held to tight standards and are made for anyone. So as you can tell by now, my main point here is that animation, video games, etc. are for everyone. Another aspect of the just for kids mentality isn't to shame others for liking childish things. It's as a way to discredit and object to criticism in the first place. The just for kids mindset essentially can be used to insult those who try to critique things they see as childish, and that because it's aimed for younger audiences, that it's alright for something to be objectively bad. Typically there are 2 reasons for this. Either A, they are simply attempting to mock some for caring so much about a product aimed at younger audiences, therefore perpetuating the stigma of only being for kids and thus nobody else should watch it, or B, they themselves like the thing being criticized and thus don't want to see it attacked. In this case, it is hard for people to accept that others may not like what they like and feel insulted when it is criticized in any way. All of us have likely been in a situation like this. All we have to do is remember most things are subjective and that it is okay to have a differing opinion. Should works for kids be critiqued? I do believe that yes, they should. As if they are truly for everyone, then of course you can find fault with it just as we find positives in it. Just make sure you're not completely ruining the fun for the audiences that like it. If the reason for discarding criticism is to excuse bad quality, this also shows a lack of respect towards kids. When someone is young, they are much more impressionable and are in a very critical learning period. The media we consume at a young age is pivotal in our growth. Kids deserve better. Why should the movies we watch be garbage? Shouldn't they be exposed to higher quality products? And to end this tangent, have you ever watched or played something you loved as a kid, as an adult, and have it not be as good as you remember? And it makes you wonder if it was ever good at all? That can be disheartening or even crushing to some. We should be able to critique the media we love so much so that it can improve and thus bring even more joy to everyone. And if we can do that, we may be able to finally break the stigma. It's not just for kids. And you know what? Even if someone tries to tell you that it is, aren't we all just kids at heart?